Picking up from our discussion on the Sophists' own questions, let's rewind the clock. We often think of the Sophists as the starting gun for Greek intellectual inquiry, but that's like saying the iPhone invented communication. The concept of Sophia or wisdom was buzzing around long before they showed up. Think of it as ancient Greece's deep, complex cultural OS running way back then. We catch glimpses of it in epic poetry, folksy sayings, the banter at fancy parties even carved into stone. It wasn't just one thing. It was a whole ecosystem of ideas about how to be smart, how to live well, how to make sense of the world. And then, boom, new forms of writing like technical guides and what we'd call history and philosophy start popping up, trying to capture and systematize this buzzing energy. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Trying to pin down exactly what Sophia meant back then is like trying to nail Jello to a wall. Everyone seemed to be giving it a shot. You had these thinkers, some we lump together as presocratics, using their brains, their skills, their organizational tricks to try and wrap their heads around a complicated world. If you pulled it off, you got a reputation, maybe as clever, maybe as wise. But nobody really agreed on the rule book. There wasn't one big tent under which everyone could comfortably fit. As things got more specialized in the 5th century, especially with the rise of figures like the Sophists, there was this growing need to figure out where you stood in relation to all the previous thinkers and what they actually contributed. It became a bit of an academic genealogy project, if you will. And naturally, people started drawing timelines, tracing how Sophia supposedly evolved from simple craft knowledge into sophisticated intellectual prowess. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, with their powerful philosophical voices, definitely push this narrative. But hold on, we have to be careful. These historical narratives aren't always neutral. Sometimes they're like someone trying to rewrite family history to look better. Ancient and modern scholars alike have crafted these developmental stories, often subtly reshaping earlier forms of wisdom to fit their own agendas. It's complicated further because sometimes when someone talks about intellectualized expertise, they use the language of skilled crafts. Pindar calls poets sophoi carpenters, wise carpenters. Heraclitus links what is sophon, the wise thing, to a helmsman steering the ship of state. Does this mean craft skills were the original source of Sophia, evolving into pure thought? Not necessarily. It might just be borrowing the respected image of the craftsman to elevate their own intellectual endeavors, not proving a direct lineage. So, what's the backdrop against which all this Sophia stuff was happening? Competition. Greece, especially in its archaic and classical phases, was a hyper-competitive place. Hesiod nailed it. The potter is angry with the potter, and the singer with the singer. This wasn't just about rival potters trying to outdo each other. It applied broadly to different fields of expertise. If you wanted to claim your achievement, you had to define it, set it apart from what others did, both past and present. The Sophists, like their predecessors, were deeply embedded in this agonistic culture. They weren't just pontificating in isolation. They were constantly measuring themselves against poets, athletes, scientists, priests, politicians, you name it. And everyone else was watching, judging, trying to figure out where these newfangled sophists fit into the grand scheme of things. Plato, for instance, puts Protagoras in a room full of other famous thinkers, forcing him to position himself within that ongoing intellectual contest. Because of this competitive vibe, Sophia wasn't monolithic. It took on all sorts of shapes, depending on who was talking and when. The Sophists and the debates surrounding them are part of this larger story of how earlier wisdom traditions were received, renewed, and reinterpreted. Different genres highlight different facets. We'll see several key themes pop up again and again. First, the idea that poetic or intellectual skill itself is somehow a master skill, a peak discipline. This thread goes way back to Hesiod and pops up again with figures like Pindar and Heraclitus, and it then gets shouted from the rooftops by the sophists like Gorgias and Protagoras. Second, the whole fraught business of polymathy, knowing lots of things. This could be used as a weapon, accusing rivals of just collecting facts without true understanding, something both Pindar and Heraclitus do. Third, the widespread practice of gathering knowledge, often in collections of maxims or didactic poems. Think Hesiod's Works and Days or Hippias' massive encyclopedic collection. Fourth, because people were claiming different versions of Sophia, ideas about deceptive or merely apparent expertise started to surface. Fifth, the drive to brand your own unique version of Sophia and shout it from the rooftops. And finally, the perennial question: how does human Sophia connect to the divine? Let's zoom in on one aspect: technical knowledge or techne. When we look at the earliest uses of Sophia in Homer, Alcman, Archilochus, it often means skilled knowledge applied to practical crafts, building things, navigating ships, driving chariots. Later thinkers like Aristotle tried to map a progression, seeing human understanding moving from basic craft knowledge through practical wisdom to theoretical wisdom. Modern scholars often follow this lead, suggesting a neat evolution from craft to poetry to general intellect. But here's the rub. Being a skilled craftsman, having techne, wasn't always a good thing. Its role in the bigger picture of Sophia was complex and sometimes controversial. It could be valued, but it could also be looked down upon. Take this passage from the hymn to Hermes. Hermes says that when a really knowledgeable musician plays the lyre, using both Sophia and techne, the lyre teaches him all sorts of things. John Bollock pointed out something fascinating here. Sophia and techne are presented as both distinct and intertwined. It's like saying you need both the theory and the practice, the insight and the skill, to unlock the instrument's secrets. You can't easily separate them in this context. It shows how deeply these concepts were already mixed together in the early understanding of expertise. But by the late 5th century, things start shifting. Thanks largely to the activities of the Sophists and others, an intellectualized version of Sophia, meaning wisdom in the philosophical sense, really takes hold. Suddenly, the relationship between Sophia and techne becomes tense. Technical skills can now be seen, as opposed to genuine intellectual understanding. We hear echoes of this battle in Plato's dialogues. Remember Callicles complaining in the Gorgias that Socrates keeps dragging in cobblers and fullers? He wants to keep the conversation highbrow, away from the trades. Rhetoric itself is called a techne, a craft, but also potentially an autocrat, hinting at the power dynamics. And then there's Protagoras, who explicitly defines his teaching against other sophists by saying, "Look, they teach useless stuff like calculations, astronomy, geometry, music. My deal is only good counsel." He's actively devaluing certain types of technical expertise to elevate his own brand of Sophia. Now contrast Protagoras with his rival Hippias as portrayed by Plato. Hippias? He's the ultimate polymath. He boasts he's the wisest guy alive because he knows the most skills, techni. He even went to Olympia dressed head to toe in stuff he made himself, his ring, his shoes, his belt, his clothes. Plus, he had a whole library of poems and prose. Plus, he understood rhythm, harmony, and grammar. He seems to embody everything that came before the push toward specialization. He's resisting the trend, showcasing a breadth of knowledge that Plato himself would later grapple with in his political philosophy. Hippias represents the opposite pole from Protagoras, the master of many trades versus the master of one essential skill. So the takeaway here is crucial. Don't fall into the trap of thinking there was a nice linear march from being a good carpenter to becoming a philosopher. Even Plato, while pushing for a purified form of philosophy, acknowledges the diversity and the live debate about different kinds of Sophia. In the Symposium, Diodama talks about the daemonic sophos, connected to the divine, versus the Banusic sophos, skilled in arts or crafts. In the Theaetetus, knowing justice is the real Sophia, while other forms are vulgar or merely craft-based. Plato's Socrates is clearly trying to carve out a space for philosophy that's distinct from making things or earning money, but only because he sees those other forms of expertise as legitimate contenders for the title of Sophia. Scholars like Kerford, Martin, and Kirke have done great work challenging the simpler Aristotelian view. Marcel Détienne, for instance, argued that in archaic Greece, there was a powerful form of speech associated with poets, seers, and kings, speech that had magical religious power, blending truth, justice, persuasion, and even deception. This started to secularize as democracy, and the hoplite class rose, paving the way for figures like the Sophists. Richard Martin emphasizes the sage figure's combination of poetic skill, political and religious activity, and public performance, all happening in a super-competitive environment. Leslie Kirk builds on this, highlighting travel and a unified tradition spanning poetry and prose, where verbal skill aimed for practical political effects, often combined with religious know-how and, yes, competition. Okay, let's dive into Hesiod, a cornerstone of early Greek wisdom. One of the oldest ways to pass on knowledge was through gnomic sayings, short, pithy maxims. Hesiod's works and Days is our prime example, showing clear links to wisdom traditions in Egypt and Mesopotamia. But he wasn't alone. Theognis had his collection, and there's mention of lost works like the Precepts of Chiron. There was even a genre called hypothekoi, literally precepts, which were collections of advice and traditional wisdom. In these works, the poet often acts as the authority, dispensing knowledge. Interestingly, Hesiod himself meditates on expertise. He praises the self-thinker, but also the person persuaded by good speech. It's all about listening to and passing on sound advice, arguably the very bedrock of Greek wisdom traditions. Now, Hesiod gets interesting in Works and Days when he talks about sailing. He admits he hasn't sailed much, he's not at all expert in seafaring or ships. So, how does he dare to talk about the sea? Because he says, the muses taught him. This is a classic move. Ralph Rosen points out that Hesiod is playing with the idea of Sophia here. He's not just talking about nautical skill, he's elevating poetic knowledge, divinely inspired, above mere technical expertise. It's a polemical moment. This passage juxtaposes two kinds of expertise, sailing and poetry, and claims poetic authority, backed by the muses, trumps the practical skill of the helmsman. It's the first time we see the verb sophizomai, to be wise or skillful, and it's used to challenge technical knowledge and privilege a different kind of, divinely sanctioned, skill. So archaic Sophia wasn't just about crafts or poetry. It covered a wide range, and we also had figures known as sophoi, sages, and those who would later be called philosophers. These categories overlapped and definitions were fuzzy. What we know about them often comes from anecdotes, and guess what? Those stories featured travel, carefully staged competitions, and displays of intellectual prowess. By the 4th century, we have solid evidence for the seven sages, though the exact list changed over time. Cities loved claiming their local hero. Famous sayings like know thyself and nothing in excess are attributed to them. And those stories? They often involve contests, like the sages passing around a prize, each claiming not to be the wisest. It's another layer of that agonistic culture. Herodotus, the father of history, gives us a fascinating window into how Sophia was understood in his time, reflecting both his own era and looking back. He frequently mentions acts of Sophia, identifies people as sophoi, and even uses the term sophistai. While he's clearly interested in the Sophists, his accounts also help us reconstruct the intellectual landscape of previous generations. For him, cleverness and expertise were definitely noteworthy. He tells us about Darius's clever groom, the advisor who saved Croesus, the Median king who gained power through justice, Amyrus of Pyrrhus, simply called the Wise, and the trickster general Themistocles, who was even awarded a prize for his Sophia. He also praises technical skill, like the Phoenician ability to dig canals, or the Arab method for getting cinnamon, and Spartan military know-how. It shows a broad appreciation for different kinds of expertise. Now, Herodotus uses the specific term sophiste 3 times, and these are super illuminating. First, in the story of Salmoxis, he mentions Pythagoras, calling him not the weakest sophistes. Second, he talks about the hero Melampus, whom he calls Sophos, teaching some Dionysian rites learned in Egypt. But then he adds that later sophistae revealed the whole subject in detail. Why the shift? Maybe Melampus was a quick learner, while the successors developed a more systematic, teachable expertise. Third, and most famously, in the Solon and Croesus story. Croesus notes that Solon, along with other sophistae from Greece, visited his court. Croesus remarks on Solon's reputation for Sophia and travel, noting he aspires to Sophia. This is the first recorded use of the verb philosophio. What's striking is that Herodotus uses sophistes in contexts of cultural exchange, often involving religious or quasi-religious knowledge. It suggests a developing, perhaps more formalized type of expertise. This brings us to the Ionian natural philosophers, the Presocratics. Their focus wasn't on defining philosophy as a discipline yet, but on understanding the natural world, figuring out patterns, giving an account of all things. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes were exploring the origins of everything. This inquiry was fluid and diverse, and even figures like Protagoras jumped in, offering his famous man is the measure. Thales himself, famous for his water theory, was included in Hippias's big collection alongside Homer and Hesiod. Finding coherence in a complex cosmos was a big deal, and those who claimed to have found it often advertised it, asserting the uniqueness of their Sophia against rivals. We see a tension here. The ancient ideal of mastering many things, like Odysseus who saw many cities and knew their minds, was now challenged by the urge to impose order, to find a single principle. That fragment attributed to Thales, seek one thing, what is wise, perfectly captures this impulse to cut through the noise. Heraclitus takes this tension between the one and the many, and the different kinds of human understanding, to another level. His worldview is built on the unity of opposites. And again we see this idea of what is sophon, the wise thing, being singular. The wise is one, he says, knowing the thought that steers all things. It's like the universe has a single, underlying principle, a kind of cosmic helmsman, and true wisdom is recognizing that. Only Heraclitus, he claims, truly grasps this. He's scathing of others. He dismisses polymathy. Much learning does not teach sense. He criticizes Hesiod for teaching many things but missing the point, and Homer for being wiser than all Greeks yet failing a simple children's riddle. He even attacks Pythagoras, accusing him of crafting his own wisdom through much learning, but calling it an evil craft. Here, technical skill techne is linked negatively to mere breadth of knowledge. Pythagoras naturally would have fired back. Amassing knowledge for him was the path to insight. He was legendary for his learning. Empedocles said he had a wealth of wits, governed wise deeds, and could see everything. He was the model traveler sage, moving from Samos to Italy, with rumors of trips to Egypt and Babylon. He wasn't just a thinker, he founded a whole way of life, complete with religious beliefs like reincarnation, and a set of cryptic rules called akousmata. He created a following, the Pythagoreans. This was a huge deal, creating a branded intellectual movement with followers. He represents a maximal vision of Sophia, embracing diversity and knowledge, so successful it generated its own school. Think of him as an early intellectual superstar, setting a precedent for the later Sophists' popularity and branding strategies. Parmenides tackles this one versus many tension in his epic poem. Imagine a young man traveling in a chariot, guided by a goddess, through all the towns of the knowing man, a clear nod to intellectual ambition and scope. The goddess promises he'll learn both the unshaken heart of truth, aletheia, which presents a radical monistic view, and the unreliable mortal opinions, doxa, which describes a more complex, pluralistic world. A two-part structure expressing that fundamental tension. And notice the competitive edge. The goddess says she's giving him doxa so no mortal thought can outstrip you. It's like she's handing him the keys to beat everyone else. Parmenides' genius was crafting this twofold vision, insisting on ultimate unity while simultaneously providing a sophisticated account of the seemingly messy world, a novel way to manage the problem of multiplicity. This drive to define and promote one's expertise wasn't limited to the Presocratics. The symposium, the elite drinking party, was a hotbed for displaying cultural knowledge and wisdom. Look at the elegies collected under the name Theognis. Here, Sophia shifts, sometimes it's pure poetic skill, sometimes it's general cleverness or skillful action. He acknowledges limits. No one is skillful at everything. But he also depicts wisdom transmission, the young guy learning from the old timer at the feast. Sophia is linked to excellence, arete, like standing firm in battle is the prize for the wise man. Yet Sophia can also trump arete, cleverness is better than rigid excellence. It shows Sophia as a flexible, highly valued quality in this social sphere. For Theognis, poetic competence is central to his Sophia. He imagines competing with rivals in Sophia by singing beautifully. And check out his famous seal of Theognis. He basically says, Surus, put a seal on these words as I exercise my skill so nobody steals them without noticing. What's he doing? Claiming ownership. It's not just about authorship in the modern sense, it's about appropriating tradition, stamping his individual perspective onto shared cultural material. The act of exercising Sophia, sophismai, is tied directly to marking his territory. His poetry shapes the audience, acculturates them, and he aims for fame using the same verb hypothesawai, to instruct, found in the Hypothekai precept collections. It's about branding his unique blend of wisdom. Think about Hipparchus, the Pisistrated tyrant. He reportedly put up stone statues, herms along the roads outside Athens, inscribed with proverbs. Socrates tells us Hipparchus made a selection of what he thought wisest and had them displayed as a showcase of his Sophia. Why? To make people admire his wisdom more than Delphi's famous oracle. Again we see that competitive streak. Notice the emphasis on selection eclecticos. This idea of selecting the best bits appears elsewhere. Heraclitus talking about Pythagoras selecting writings, Theognis implying selection, the collectors of maxims, even Xenophon describing Socrates selecting good stuff from old books. It leads directly to figures like Hippias, who went absolutely nuts with this, compiling lists of Olympic winners, writing dialogues listing exemplary actions, and creating massive encyclopedic collections. It's the systematic gathering and curating of knowledge, presented as his own curated wisdom. Xenophanes, the poet and critic, really leaned into this competitive spirit. Like Theognis, he cared about sympathetic ethics, arguing against discussing war and instead promoting useful topics. Like Heraclitus, he wasn't shy about bashing famous predecessors and contemporaries, Homer, Hesiod, Pythagoras, Thales, Epimenides. Proclus even says he wrote lampoons Siloe, mocking all poets and philosophers. He tried to define his own contribution. Our Sophia is better than brute strength, he argued. It's a direct challenge to the athletic ideal that dominated Greek culture. He positions himself as a poet whose wisdom is vital for good governance, performed publicly, and designed to undermine competitors. He uses phrases like our Sophia and good Sophia to clearly distinguish his brand from others he deemed inferior or useless. Now let's switch gears to praise poetry, specifically epinician odes celebrating athletic victories. You might think this is a strange place to find deep thoughts on Sophia, but poets like Pindar used it to explore these ideas. Perhaps they were responding to critiques like Xenophanes, defending the value of athletic skill and those who celebrated it. Bacchylides, for example, writes that mortals pursue glory in countless ways, listing countless forms of human understanding. He includes the skilled man, Sophos, whether he gets fame from the graces or knows prophecy, alongside the archer and the landowner. Is expertise in herding cattle or seduction included under Sophia here? It's unclear, but he presents a broad picture of expertise with a long history. Elsewhere, he shows Sophia being passed down through education. Pindar is even more complex. He's like an encyclopedia of Sophia, touching on themes that would later dominate discussions about the Sophists. His ideal version of Sophia wins out in competition. It's authentic, not fake, not offensive to the gods, not deceptive, acknowledges hard work, and comes from divine inspiration. It's not necessarily a step towards formal philosophy, but an attempt to carve out his own legitimate space within the spectrum of possible wisdoms. He uses Sophia vocabulary widely. Sophisma lists products of Sophia like inventions. He talks about the intellectual and ethical competence of the wise in politics, and assumes a familiarity with common sayings and folk wisdom. It's a rich, multifaceted concept in his hands. Pindar really prides himself on his poetic expertise, seeing it as combining artistic skill with superior judgment. He envisions himself as preeminent for Sophia. Poets are generally considered sophoi, and even discerning audiences are called sophoi. Then comes a linguistic bombshell. In Isthmian 5, he refers to warrior heroes as an object of concern to the Sophistae. This is the first recorded use of the noun Sophistes. Given the context, it almost certainly refers to poets. But crucially, Pindar insists technical skill isn't enough. You need divine help. He attributes Sophia to the Muses and Apollo because of their knowledge and patronage. The old Homeric distinction between divine and human knowledge is now filtered through the lens of Sophia. In a fragmentary paean, he even says seeking the deep path of wisdom without the Muses is blindness. Divine sanction is key. However, Pindar firmly keeps Sophia on the mortal side. In one fragment he asks, "What do you think wisdom is, where one man just slightly surpasses another? You won't find the gods' plans with a mortal mind." Later commentators, like Stobaeus, quote Pindar as criticizing the natural scientists for plucking the fruit of wisdom unripe. Now Pindar wouldn't have used that exact term for them, but it suggests a suspicion of those who tried to explain things without acknowledging the divine, perhaps those demystifying the gods' workings. There's a clear boundary. Olympian 9 gets really nuanced. It ends with a meditation on natural versus taught skills. Pindar favors what comes by nature, physis, but acknowledges many try to win fame with taught excellence, techne. He even says, something in which God takes no part may best be left in silence. Sounds like an aristocratic preference for innate talent. But wait, the following preamble adds layers. Some roads lead farther than others. One method of training, meleta, doesn't suit everyone. The ways of skill, Sophiae, are steep. Note the plural Sophiae. It's not just one skill, but multiple paths, all difficult. This echoes Hesiod's steep path, but Pindar's plurals suggest complexity. And remember, the poem starts by saying humans become good and expert according to divine will. Abuse the gods, and that's hateful, Sophia. So while he values nature, he recognizes the importance of skill, but insists both must bow to religious sensibility. It's a delicate balancing act, anticipating Protagoras' famous discussion of nature and nurture. Pindar also plays with popular expectations about Sophia. He notes that success after toil makes you seem wise, but so does getting lucky without effort. He challenges the link between learning and polymathy. When boasting of his own vast poetic knowledge, he says, "The one who knows many things by nature is wise. Those who have learned it cry vainly." He's dismantling the idea that learning equals breadth of knowledge. And then there are darker shades. He calls reviling the gods hateful Sophia, linking cleverness divorced from the divine to rhetoric that undermines morality. He warns that even expertise can be tied to profit, citing Asclepius destroyed for reviving someone for money. And Sophia can deceive. Expertise deceives, leading people astray with stories, he says, applying it to Homer and Odysseus. This critique of potentially misleading or impious speech foreshadows later attacks on the Sophists. So, where does this leave us as we approach the Sophists? They didn't emerge in a vacuum. They inherited this incredibly rich, tangled web of ideas about Sophia. The interplay between natural talent and training, the analogy between the athlete and the moral trainer, the constant competition, the branding of individual expertise, the debate between knowing many things and having a unifying framework. Figures like Protagoras explicitly talked about needing both nature and training. Gorgias, memorialized at Olympia, claimed the fairest technique for training virtue, echoing Xenophane's claims while surpassing Pindara's take. The Sophists, like their predecessors, had to carve out their niche, present their unique brand of Sophia, compete fiercely, and navigate the complex relationship between knowledge, teaching, and the divine. Their diverse practices were in many ways a continuation and intensification of the long-standing traditions of Greek wisdom.